welcome everybody. Lovely to see you. Please get involved in the chat. And hello, Louise. Good evening.
Good evening. I said I'll jig there to that music. It's quite jolly.
I see it's still sunny outside for you.
It is, and apologies about the very bright light coming in the window. I haven't got a very good blind in this room.
We don't have sunshine very often, do we? Although we've had quite a lot of it recently. Okay, so we're here to talk about why is nutrition so important in the early years, and to, make sure that we get it right. And I'm all about getting things right. Everything I do in my job with Spark is about helping people to get it right. So, but I don't know a great deal. I don't know a great deal about food, really. It's not. I wouldn't say it was my subject. But it is yours, Louise.
It is mine, yes.
So where should we start? What should we start talking about?
I think it is such a big subject. I think, first of all, if we just start with some of the reasons why I think people might be a bit jaded by hearing the nutrition message, because I've been working in this for 11 years. I fell into childcare and the early years by accident. So I never set out to particularly work with children or informative nutrition, but I kind of just fell into that. I'll come on to that later. But I think in the whole 11 years, I have just seen so many messages in the media that have been really damaging to the whole topic of food and health and nutrition. There's a real blame and shame culture in the media around food and people's approach to food, and we really misunderstand obesity. And I think obesity and nutrition are linked, but often if you start to talk about nutrition, people will just switch off because they've heard so much and seen so much in the media, real scaremongering headlines, which may have a place in scientific research, but actually the headline, no one's going to read the article because the headline is just going to put them off and alienate them from the topic completely. So first of all, nutrition is really important to everything, but I can understand why perhaps people do feel a bit disengaged from the subject. But why is it so important? Just in a nutshell, the food we eat impacts on every single cell in our body. There are approximately, I haven't counted them, 37 trillion cells in the body. So that's every movement, every decision, and every emotion. So food impacts on every single thing we do. And that's to start with in a nutshell.
That does make sense, really, when you think about it, actually, doesn't it, really? I mean, you mentioned obesity. Now, I've recently sold my last nursery. But obesity, I mean, food was always a headache for a nursery provider, for one week, whether it be the person cooking it, the order arriving, or whatever. There was always an issue around food. But obesity has been very much in the headlines about, young children being obese. But in my nurseries, I had 4. I don't think we really, wouldn't have identified any of them as obese.
No, it's interesting because the figures do, I mean, the child weight measurement program is slightly, tainted in terms of the actual results because we weigh rather than use body composition. So the difference there is a dense child, and they can be dense as in heavy and stocky but have very low body fat, would come out of that child measurement rate reading as obese or overweight. And the letters would come home saying your child is obese, have you thought of doing this? And it's really stark and not very supportive and not very friendly. But the real scary thing is we do have a childhood obesity problem. There is no doubt that some of the readings and some of the data is not quite right, and we'll have, heavy children within those obese readings for sure.
Yeah. I see more children obese in primary school, and certainly, as they grow older. And I'll accept that eating habits start very, very, very young. And I'm sure that all has an impact on good practice. If you have good practice eating food, and also the types of food. I mean, my children weren't allowed sweets at all when they were growing up. I don't think they're big sweet eaters now, but as soon as they were out of my sight, they did binge them for a while. I know that.
Well, one of the things that I talk about, and there is so much to this. We could literally talk on many things you've just said in detail, but the sweet thing is interesting because I didn't give my son, who's 9 now, refined sugar until the age of 3. Any refined sugar at all. It was literally just fruit and natural sugars that he had. I offered him chocolate on his 3rd birthday and he didn't want it. The association that children have with treats, and I hate using the word treats as food, comes in at a very young age, but it comes from the grown-up. And I talk about this with my work with early years settings providers. It's your enthusiasm, your body language, I'm going to give you something that's really exciting to eat that gets the child excited about that food. And you mentioned nursery children not having the telltale signs of obesity, but obesity markers don't need to be visible on the outside. So we know that in the UK, children are consuming more ultra-processed foods or UPFs than any other country with a Western diet, including America. So we always assume that America's kind of, if you can say, leading the way, because it's certainly not leading in the positive sense, but we are actually consuming more. And I think in the sort of the 2 to 5 age group, 61% of calories can be coming from ultra processed foods. So the danger there is not necessarily that that's going to equate to toddler obesity, because toddlers are very active, they have high dietary fat needs, they have high energy needs. The type of food they need to fuel their growth and development is very important at that stage. So when we say babies and toddlers have high fat needs, it's not fat coming from ultra processed foods. So they may not show visible signs of obesity, but the habits, the food behaviours, the palate development will be geared towards preference of those foods. And, as you know, patterns and behaviours laid down in those very early years can be really deep rooted and hard to change, and children don't understand the concept of moderation. So there's no point saying to a child, these are not very healthy, have it in moderation. They don't get it.
No. That's interesting, but it's like, so what you're saying is, I'm going to try and do an analogy. We used to have animals come into the nurseries on a regular basis. Now, when we had the snakes, I used to have to pep talk all the staff to say, if you really don't like snakes, just don't be there. Just go away, because how you feel about snakes is going to impact on the children.
Yeah.
So you're saying the same thing is happening with food, really. A child that's made to feel a snake is something to be scared of at 3 is probably going to be scared of snakes the whole of their lives, aren't they?
Probably, because the first experience is probably quite traumatic.
Yeah, well, it's made to be traumatic, isn't it? The adults' reactions. So it's exactly the same with food. Yeah, that's. I can see, you can see that, but you don't really think about it, do you?
Well, this is it. As soon as you do stop to think about it, you think, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I have this conversation with every nursery manager, every early years professional, every school, and they're like, oh, yeah, that never thought of it that way. Of course,
no,
but
that's
it's
right.
just not thinking of it that way. So one of the things I'd like to see happen is actually this whole, the whole thing about nutrition in policy is very much just implement a healthy, balanced diet. I'd like to see a much broader remit about the whole role that food has on formative development, including this whole role of food building our patterns, habits, behaviors, and addictions, because we've got to remember that food addictions do exist and are quite serious. Even if it's just emotional eating, can still cause that child to become a grown-up with an unhealthy food relationship. And lots of people who had a bad relationship with food, they treat themselves, they reward themselves, and then they feel guilty and they deny themselves. But that battle, metabolically and emotionally, is not healthy for anyone. So if we can help children to grow up understanding the biology of food, i.e., yes, this is a plate of food and we need to eat it to be full, and this is what happens to the food when we eat it, and all children are fascinated by digestion, anything to do with periods, just fascinating. But the wider bit as well, in terms of the role that food has on our health, on our future, on building our brain. A lot of the work I do is on the 0 to 3 and 0 to 5 window of brain development and how the food fuels that. And then in the older years with the brain links, it's about how food helps them to get through a day at school for many, because if they're lacking in certain nutrients, then getting through that day at school can be quite challenging, because they'll be lacking elements that fuel the frontal lobe to enable them to problem solve, to enable them to sit still, concentrate, remember, focus, all the things that they might get told off for. But it's not actually their fault. They're just biologically not able to do those things. And so I'd like to see more of that kind of level of understanding.
Right. So, I mean, we've been doing quite a lot of these debates around the brain and how to support children to enable the brains to grow as big as they possibly can before they go to school, because that's what's going to make a big difference to their life chances and their well-being later in life. But we haven't touched on food. We've been more concentrating on activities and getting parents involved and making the most of every learning opportunity and helping parents be developmentally appropriate with their children, not asking them to do things before they're ready, and building partnerships and that sort of thing. But we haven't done anything about food. And so where would we start? Well,
again,
because I think early years training is very much around the curriculum, around what Ofsted needs, rather than and keeping to the YFS framework as far as the standards are concerned. How many toilets we've got to have, how much floor space, numbers of staff, and whether they're qualified or not, and that sort of thing. And it does mention that we need to be giving the children a balanced diet in EYFS, from the top of my head. I'm sure it says something like that.
It has a sentence to that effect, yes.
Yeah, but there aren't training courses. I know that you do training courses, Louise,
there is
but generally, and all that information will come at the end, folks. So don't worry, we've got website and contact details and everything at the end. But you don't see, and you see, actually, you do see quite a lot of training now around well-being, but you don't see anything about food or nutrition.
No, and not to the depth it needs to be. And that's what I want to see change, and that's what I want to see come into to be not even an additional train. It needs to be an additional training to start with, but then just to become embedded. So actually, we know when we're planning a menu or when we're outsourcing a catering provider that this is what we need to have on there. We need to make sure that fish is on there at least once a week, because that might be the only time that child gets fish if they're not having fish at home. Fish are very expensive at the moment. If we have vegan children in the nursery, we need to make sure that we're working very closely with the parents to make sure that they know all the developmental nutrients that are essential, that are lacking, and that they are the ones responsible, not the nursery, for ensuring that all of those levels are topped up, because you can't expect a child to come to a normal nursery setting and you cater for their full dietary requirements if they're vegan.
Actually, I did know that. I did know that. We did know that. Okay.
Yeah. Because there's an increasing number of vegan children now in the 0 to 5 age group, which I find slightly scary. But yeah, they do seem to be on the increase.
What about plant-based? Now, I've never had that in a nursery setting, but where I'm sure that nurseries are beginning to, and preschools perhaps too, are beginning to encounter that one where the parent just wants a plant-based diet. Or would they call that vegetarian?
A vegetarian diet would include, there are many different diets. I can give you a fact sheet that I created afterwards explaining all those, like lacto-ovo vegetarian, all different versions of it, because it can be quite confusing for nurseries to actually interpret the parents' desires with what's actually included and things. But I always encourage, when I work with settings on menus, to have plant-based options for all children. That we're not bringing children up to think a meat is essential for every day. It isn't. If you're a meat eater, that's fine. You don't need to eat meat every day. And it helps balance the cost. So when I'm working on menu development, I will be asking for salmon because it is the best source of essential fatty acid. And coming back to brain development, that is the thing that is needed for brain development, essential fatty acids to really build that 40% of the brain. Salmon is expensive, but we can counter that with plant-based dishes like lentils, lentil bolognese, mushroom bolognese, full of B vitamins, full of protein, still looks like a bolognese dish. It doesn't need to be beef because it's going to be cheaper to have the plant-based option for all children. It doesn't need to just be the exclusion diet children. And then you can spend money on the salmon, and you don't have to say we can't afford fish, because I know a lot of menus have taken fish off because of the price. But that worries me as well, because it is so key for brain development.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so before we came on air, I was talking about how I hate cooking. I don't have time for it, but everyday cooking is something, and this is in the home, you know. Everyday cooking for me is a bore, and so I can see why many children have processed food, because it's easy to reach for, easy to pop in the microwave, easy, you know, it's quick and what have you. I mean, what can we do? I mean, part of our job as early years educators, first of all, I think we need to be educated, Louise. So I take on board that fact, and the fact that there isn't that much training out there around food. And you've already said, you know, people are turned off by nutrition. You know, it's not something that they see as being important enough.
I think as long as the children are fed, then that tends to be the kind of message that comes through the EYFS, the Eat Better, Start Better. I've seen, you know, yes, they give some information in there, but as long as the children are fed, that's kind of, you know.
That's it, yeah. But what I was going on to say was, part of our role as early years educators is to educate parents, but we can't educate parents if we don't know enough about it ourselves. And I'm sure I was trying to think where my information about nutrition comes from, because I do know about certain foods and, you know, the importance of certain foods, and I was wondering whether that came from my school cookery lessons, which I did actually do quite well at, or whether that came from my training. I did have a very thorough training. I was very fortunate from my NNEB. It wasn't just an ordinary NNEB I had something a little bit special. So and I was trying to think about, you know, where I got my nutritional knowledge from. But then I was thinking about my children, and they didn't do cookery at school, you know, not in the same way. And what I'm trying to say here is, I don't know if early years educators currently are being educated in nutrition, or whether it is purely, you know, you need to be, and you need, you know, you need to be thinking of food hygiene, and you need to be thinking of special diets, but the actual content of what the children are eating or being given perhaps isn't taught. I'm not sure. Does anybody on the chat recently qualified or is involved in training? Perhaps you'd let us know.
So while we wait for that, I would just say, in my experience, it tends to be very much left to individual settings to interpret as much or as little of that message. And nearly every single one, including a large outsourced caterer that I've worked with, didn't have what I would consider to be enough nutritional knowledge for feeding children. Yes, the children were fed and there was nothing wrong, but to then, with my eyes, scrutinize the menu, look, that's way below DRV for protein, that's way below your essential fatty acids, you've not got enough of these vitamins, you've not got enough of this, you're not talking about this. And it was okay, right, we'll make changes, but it just wasn't known in the first place. And so I think some settings will probably go all out there and be going above and beyond, but they'll probably be finding it out for themselves. I don't think, and I may be wrong, and hopefully somebody can pipe up and tell us if that's the case, that I don't think there is something out there that is sort of, it should be mandatory, in my opinion, because then we know that everybody has to do it.
Perhaps we need an early years accreditation. I know that we did a local one. We did a Snack Attack Award, I think it was called. But there isn't anything, you know, like Millie's Mark for first aid training.
No.
There's nothing out there around nutrition.
There are things around sugar, like you say, the snack attack. There's Sugar Wise, which is an accreditation for schools, which I've been helping to get brought down a level to early years as well. But it's just on sugar intake. It's the whole thing since the sugar tax, and actually that's not the main problem. There are many more issues other than our sugar intake, and we can't just focus on that one thing as being the culprit for any health issues, because it isn't. It's a big factor, undoubtedly, but it's not. It's not the only issue. You know, we need to look really, really closely at the links with the early years and the impact on later life. And this is what I think, this is why we're very reactive in this country. We're not very proactive. I'm going into full rant mode now. We're not very reactive. So if we look at the NHS at the moment and how it's obviously, you know, we're in chaos, strikes here, there and everywhere, poor, overworked, all over the place, terrible, you know, overworked staff. You know, we've had an amazing experience with them, and I cannot, you know, they're amazing, but they are breaking point, and we have a generation of children that are growing up with adult diseases they didn't used to get, that they're going to get more and more. Type 2 diabetes, for example, 2000 first UK case of a child with type 2 diabetes. That was just over 20 years ago. We didn't have any children with it. Now we've got over nearly 3,500. That's a chronic lifelong condition that those children will, in a horrible way, cost the NHS a lot of money in the future. If we looked proactively at supporting, and it's not just about sugar type 2 diabetes, it's about much more, at supporting the sector. The thing about the early years sector is, sorry, I'm on a soapbox now. You've got.
Fine, you carry on, because I'm sure I'll take over. Go on.
The early years has an amazing influence in a child's life. You are in many ways more influential than the parents. You see them more than the parents. You have this amazing influence, and that is so empowering. You could do so much. You could literally shape the health of a generation with some, as I say, subtle things, because people are like, oh yeah, think of that. Oh yeah, we'll do that. It wouldn't take much. It just needs a big push to enforce something that people then do, and it becomes culture and it becomes embedded. Off my soapbox now.
It's okay. I often rant about how if more financial resources put into early years, we'd be spending less money on prisons, the National Health Service, etc. That's one of my things. Mm-hmm. And really, you know, what we do in early years should be more highly thought of, because actually we're as important as doctors and nurses, mm-hmm. and surgeons and lawyers and mm-hmm. barristers, because we are actually moulding children for the rest of their lives. Yeah. But food, you know, comes too far down the list, obviously, in that context. Okay, so I think in the town where I had my nurseries, we actually were quite proactive as settings. We wanted, you know, food could be a USP, you know, if you mm-hmm. had your own mm-hmm. chef, or if you declared that you didn't have E numbers mm-hmm. and salt in your diets, you know, that was a sort of, could be a pull for parents to choose you. So mm-hmm. there was a sort of a reputation race, I suppose, around what you gave children to eat for snack and what meals were, and whether you allowed parents to bring in packed lunch, even though they should be allowed to, you know. So I think perhaps we were fortunate in that respect, rather than maybe, you know, the nurseries that you're talking about that really don't know what they're doing. They're just filling children with something, so they're satisfied. I
mean, that's slightly harsh, you know, that they're doing. Well, you know, they have interpreted a healthy, balanced diet. It's just under my scrutiny. It's not quite, you know.
Right, okay, all right. Forgive me.
They're not giving them turkey twizzlers and chips, you know. No, I don't want.
No, but there was a time I can remember when I first opened my nurseries. There was a local nursery that was taken to court by the parents because they were giving their child too much sugar in their diet. So, and that's okay, that's 30 years ago possibly, but you know, potentially that could still happen today, couldn't it, if a nursery wasn't providing?
Absolutely, and more so now with the cost of living crisis, that is going to have a huge impact. I've already said that many settings are taking fish off the menu. Decisions over food choices for some settings are going to be based on just affordability. Nutrition, unfortunately, will not be the driving factor because they can't afford it to be. And I've already seen this with some wider network of, well, we've had to stop doing that, and just, if we can just put things in the oven on a tray and give them that with some frozen peas, they're fed and it's not terrible. It's not brilliant, but it's not terrible. But the cost of living crisis is going to have a huge impact. But my big rant over that is the escalating health and wealth divide, because we'll then have children who are getting off to a worse start in life before the age of 5. And we know that when that happens, they're on catch up, if they ever catch up, for the rest of their, you know, their education. And that's a massive factor with this blooming cost of living crisis in the government's lack of attention on these ultra processed food offers, which unfortunately are the things that are driven by price for many people, not just nurseries but families, because you walk in and that's
no, I agree.
There's no offers on fruit and veg, there's no offers on healthy things.
No, I agree, and that goes back to we keep talking about educating the educators so they can educate the parents, but it's going to be a bit of a long. Okay, so can you give us an idea what you would put in a menu for a week? What would a menu be?
So a menu for a week. Okay. So breakfasts, normally if we have children in for breakfast, I would suggest something like a porridge, because oats are really cheap. You don't have to buy the jumbo oats because you might be catering for the tiny stages as well. So porridge, with obviously you might have different dietary requirements for your milks, but it's quite easy. It's quite easy to tweak your porridge requirements. You could put banana with that, but not one banana per child, you know, that is too much. So kind of, you know, mash some banana with some cinnamon. We can introduce spices and herbs willy-nilly with children. They need to develop that. They don't need everything to be bland. Some frozen fruit like blueberries, because frozen fruit tends to be cheaper. Get them out overnight so they're defrosted, and then they make the porridge go nice and purple as well, which is quite visually appealing to children. Something that I don't like to see, just boxed cereals and toasts. It doesn't look like a lot of thought's gone into the breakfast, and whilst boxed cereals can claim to be fortified because they have to fortify them with things like iron and B vitamins and vitamin D, because children tend to be low in them. Just because it's fortified doesn't mean it's healthy. They've often still got sugar as the second ingredient. And an interesting thing, when you're looking at labels, they have to legally put the ingredients in order. So if sugar is the second or third, it's really high. So it should be avoided. And so yes, something like a porridge, a snack mid-morning. I like to see something like a tuna pate, homemade tuna pate. It's basically tin tuna with some soft cheese, lime juice. It's not dairy free, obviously, and it has got fish in it, but it's a really good source of omega-3 fatty acid. It's nice and savoury with some cucumber sticks or maybe some pita bread slices or both, and just, you know, nice savoury snacks. Snacks don't need to be sweet all the time, because then we are encouraging more of a sweet tooth. Lunch being the big meal, normally would be, like I say, mushroom bolognese. Surprisingly goes down quite well, because children don't like mushrooms because they're slippy and texturally quite weird. But the way that you do a mushroom bolognese is they're all chopped up like mince, so it doesn't feel like a slippy, slimy mushroom. It feels like a bolognese. So something like that goes down well, because, you know, spaghetti and sauce normally goes down quite well with children. So seasonally, you know, we can give children salads if they're exciting salads. Children like a salad that I do, which is it's a chopped broccoli salad with apple and red pepper, and you just chop it all up really small. I've got a magic machine that I get into nurseries when I can get funding to do so, which chops it all up really small, makes a little dressing with apple cider vinegar, good for their guts. We need to give children more gut friendly foods, and it's a little dressing, but it's just tiny little pieces, like specks of broccoli. So you can pop it in and just, it's not like it's not like eating some broccoli. So we can give children salads. They do, I have seen evidence they do eat them with like breads and cheeses and things. We can do things like that. And then tea, I like to see tea being quite an independent thing for children to get involved with. So they could get involved with making things themselves, like a wrap station, where they get their own wrap, they get their own little bowls. I think children will try more if they feel that, well, they'll try more if they feel they've got that control over their choice. And if there's 4 vegetables and they pick 2, they'll think, oh, I got away with it because they wanted me to have 4. But really, we think we'd be glad if they have 1. So they feel like they feel like they have some authority and some independence, and they tend to like that. So I think tea time's a good time to be. It's a bit less stressful than lunch, I normally find, and you can have a bit more. You might say not at all, it's all very stressful, but they can have a bit more freedom and flexibility with picking their food and sitting down and eating it slightly differently than they do at the lunch as well. So, and water, mainly water. Not squash. I'm not a fan of squash.
No, I'm not either. What about meal times? I mean, I would say that children should serve themselves when possible, when they're stage appropriate. And we served food on very large plates. So we used to give the children a tiny, and I mean tiny little piece of everything on their plate. And then they could help themselves to seconds, thirds, whatever they wanted. And that always, I mean, the number of parents that would come in, won't eat peas, won't drink milk, won't do this, won't do that. But in a group environment, generally, children do, don't they?
Yeah. Oh yeah, they do, because there'll be one bowl that'll be going down quicker than the other. So people will panic and try to get in that bowl to get some more, whether they want it or not. The fear of missing out means that they might dive into the bowl of carrots, even if they didn't want a carrot. So we're all the same. We all have that fear of missing out. So it tends to help with peer pressure, not for all children, obviously. We know some children have got real issues with food, and then that wouldn't help them. But for many, the peer pressure would just be enough to make them try new things and find that actually it's quite palatable. I quite like that. But it helps with food waste as well, because when we pile so much on their plates in the first place, what we think is their portion size, it can be off-putting for them. But then if they don't eat it, it's just wasted. Whereas if it's in the middle, somebody else can have it. So it is a much better policy.
I mean, I was always made to eat. You've got to eat that as a child before you can have your pudding and that sort of thing. I mean, what do people do on the chat? In fact, on social media, I saw, because in my view is, if the child doesn't want it, you take it away. They can have their second course, and food should be done and dusted within 20 minutes. That's my view. I feel, whether right or wrong, well, you can tell me, Louise. I feel if they haven't eaten it in 20 minutes, then they don't need it. And when the next meal comes around, they'll get on with it, won't they?
If they're just a slow eater, then they're still going to be sitting there and they'll still be getting through it. So you wouldn't obviously think of taking it away in that instance. But if they're not,
sorry, I don't mean remove the food from the child at all. I mean, what hasn't.
If they've not shown an interest
and they're still eating it, that's absolutely fine. I don't take plate food away. But but meal times can be a very long, drawn-out process, particularly in group settings. And I don't think it needs to be, particularly where the nursery all do it together. We never all sat down to eat together. One table would start, and then the next table would start, and then the next table. So they would be finishing at different times and starting at different times. But I think it can be quite long-winded, particularly. I was saying about social media, but there was a setting asking, what do other settings do? Because in their nursery, the children have to eat what they've got on their plate before they can have anything else.
I don't like that.
No, I think it's very old-fashioned, but it's about educating staff, isn't it?
I don't like it for two reasons. One is that children are very good at naturally knowing when they're full. Children they have a very good cutoff, and they know if they're full and they will stop eating. And if they're genuinely full, they will just stop eating. My son is brilliant at stopping eating. And I'm like, do you want, if he's had what I feel is nutritious and everything else, and if we're having pudding, which is quite rare, I'm like, do you want pudding? And he will be very good and say, no, I'm full. And me and the husband are like, so are we, but but we're having pudding because we're grown-ups and we're stupid, and we forget that natural balance of we're full, but we just go, well, keep going. But children are brilliant.
Yeah, but is that because there was an expectation to finish what was on your plate when you were a child?
See, I had that expectation as a child, but I've never put that onto my child because I would never.
No. But what I'm trying to say is, as adults, we can change things, can't we, for our children? But a habit is very difficult to give up.
Yeah, so a habit for a grown-up is that we finish the plate, because that is what we're, you don't waste food, it's on your plate, you eat it. And so we keep going, even though we're not hungry, we keep going. Yeah. Children are good at not doing that, so we don't want to make them feel they have to finish their plate, because otherwise they'll end up like us as grown-ups and overeat. Because once you start to bypass that natural fullness, and you start to bypass and you ignore it, like anything, when we ignore our body, we become out of tune with it. So children are quite in tune with their fullness until we help them to override it by making them sit until they're far too full to carry on eating. Or the other reason I don't like that statement, making them think that their meal is something to overcome to get to what's perceived as a reward, such as the pudding. Yeah, I don't like calling them treats. But yeah, so sit there and eat that, and you can have this, and the whole body language about this is really exciting. Look, you can have a lovely pudding if you eat your broccoli. The body language changes. The child just like begrudgingly would feel that they had to get through the plate of food to get to the reward of the pudding. And I always say, when I work with settings, that we shouldn't reward, comfort, or bribe with food, because all of those are drivers for emotional eating. Children, teens, and adults. Very, very hard cycle to break.
Yes, I can tuck into a packet of biscuits very easily if I am not feeling okay.
Well, it's like I always say to settings, if you have a child who's upset, or they fall over, or they hurt themselves, and you go to comfort them, obviously it's a natural instinct to go to comfort them. Often you'll be sitting with them, comforting them, have a nice cup of tea, or not a cup of tea, but have a nice glass of milk and a biscuit. That'll make you feel better, won't it? We'll get you a biscuit. Come with me and we'll get you a biscuit. The biscuit's not going to make them feel better. Your cuddle and nice voice was enough to make them feel. That's all they wanted. That made them feel better. If we throw a biscuit into the mix, then the neurological association of your comfort biologically equates then to the biscuit. So as a grown-up, if you're stressed, you want a cuddle and some nice words, but the biology remembers the biscuit. And when I do my brain course and talk to people about the brain, it's the whole dopamine and pleasure and reward center of the brain that is activated with certain foods, and how those habits can form really strongly in the early years.
Yes. Yes. Sorry, my brain is ticking over here, because I'm thinking I hate making food. Food for me is outside the nursery environment. Food for me is a pain in the neck, and I don't keep proper meal times for that reason, because other things become more important. But as a child, my mother was not or is not a foodie. She doesn't like cooking. She hates everyday food, just like I do. So I've obviously got that, from there. But I do enjoy treating people to food. I do enjoy cooking for other people, which is that's a pleasure, isn't it? That's a feeder. Something feeds people. I enjoy that sort of thing. And my grandmother, because I was brought up very much as with an extended family, and my paternal grandmother used to feed everybody, even the milkman and the postman in the morning. And we lived on a farm, and so she'd have all the workmen in for lunch. Be sitting around this big table with plates of food to choose from, you know, and that I think is where I get my love of entertaining people with food, all from my childhood.
This is it. When you think about your eating habits and your fond memories and how you're smiling now, reliving that, food is so emotive and it's so deep rooted, and our relationship with food is so important, not from a biological perspective. Of course, it's important from a biological perspective, but so many food memories. A smell of food can trigger a happy memory, a place, a person, a country. You know, it's so emotive. And I think we have to remember just there is so much more to food, and there is so much more to the food relationship. And children are at their most influential when they're in your care in early years. They're at their most influential development stages. So everything you do, say, and your body language around food is literally shaping their future food relationship. And their future food relationship is shaping their future health.
Yes, and that brings me to consistency now, because I'm thinking, right, okay, in a busy nursery, you could have, well, you'll have different people working different shifts, you know, the earlies, the lates. Somebody might work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Somebody else might work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You know, you have different working patterns. So really, there needs to be a policy around the expectations, just like you would around what you do if a child has a temper tantrum, what you do if a child bites another child. You know, there needs to be some sort of, otherwise the child's going to get mixed messages, aren't they? I mean, they've already got possibly mixed messages anyway between home and nursery. You know, we do it here this way, and you do it there, you know, that way there, which is why it's so important to work with each other, which is something that I'm very passionate about, working with parents as equal partners. But within a nursery setting, you could also have different expectations over meal times and those how you handle situations around food to ensure that children are having right messages, that they're not getting, you know, I can see that being a big headache. Not, it shouldn't be. There are ways over it. It's all through collaboration and support, and
it's culture,
understanding it.
Yeah,
it's a cultural thing.
It's understanding the importance and why it's needed. So when I work with settings, I always do leaflets and like PDFs of every subject we talk about in a very easy to. So it's like a brain, very snapshot of the brain nutrition, but I'll do one for parents, a slightly different language for parents. I always change the language for the home, one for the setting. So there's like the professional documents for use in the setting, and then there's ones so that you don't have to have those awkward conversations with the parents. You can say, oh, look, we've got our range of PDFs here that we can give you, that we work with Louise on. She's got videos on our website where, you know, she talks about these things if you want to go and have a look in more detail. So it's definitely a cultural thing. And I think once, it doesn't take much, it's just that first stage. And one nursery I'm working with at the moment, they got it in the team meeting. There was about 40 of them, and they got it, but they were like, oh, we never thought about that. Can you do? And then they started to bounce ideas off each other. Can you do this? Can you cover this? We've never done this. All it takes is the start of a conversation with a setting. And, you know, they do want to feed children. They do want to feed them well. They do want to understand what role they have in their development and how influential. And I always say, you are so influential. You are so empowered in your job. I know you're not recognized. I know it's a hard sector. I know it's a demoralizing role at times. And, you know, people still say, you know, you babysit children and all those horrible things that we have to contend with as a sector, which you shouldn't have to. But, you know, just to remind people, you are so influential, so important, and you have this amazing ability to change a child's life.
Yes. And anything perhaps is better than what's happening currently. I'm saying that because when I did my training, part of it was with children from deprived backgrounds, and we were actually encouraged to have special relationships with children during our 2 years training. We would have a special child that we would take out and we would do activities with. And I couldn't get to grips with that to start with, because I thought it was really cruel, because obviously they were going to lose us. but having something that is good, even if it's for a short time, still has an ongoing benefit for that child on a long-term basis. So you know, just changing, as you said earlier, just changing little things to start with will still have an impact on the children, won't it?
And it will have a ripple effect. It'll have a ripple effect, because you'll start to just you'll do something, you think, oh, well, Louise said this, or this document said this, so I watched her video, and it will just drip in. I just tend to get in people's heads, and then they're like, oh yeah, I was doing this and I thought of you, and it was like, you know, so it's a ripple effect. And it's just because, you know, when I talk about food and when I go into settings, I'm never, you know, saying they've done anything wrong or anything's the matter. It's just let's look at, you know, what a child needs, how we can best do that, how important you are in that, how you can be so influential in this child's health and development. You literally can shape their future. And these are the really subtle things that we can do, and it's really straightforward. It's body language. It's a bit more of an embedded knowledge of a child's formative development. You know, the brain I've mentioned, the skeleton is important as well. We don't reach peak bone mass until late teens, early 20s, but certainly the early childhood window, 0 to 5, 0 to 7, in terms of peak bone mass, is really important for laying down those initial foundations of bone mass. So nutrition and movement are really important within that age group as well. So it's just that greater awareness of the biological pace of growth and development, but also the emotional and the neurological sort of connections and links that we have with food, that we have as grown-ups, our influence, everything from the way our eyes light up when we see cake, and the way that we say certain foods a certain way and other foods another way. You know, it's all subtle, but we all do it.
Yeah, and we need to be more conscious about it. Right, come on, folks that are listening to us. Let's have some comments or something. I mean, what do you do in your settings? Do you all work? Tell us where you work. What sort of place do you work in? That would be helpful.
Are they still
because
there?
I'm talking a lot about nurses, just because that's my background. I mean, I've worked in schools too, and I've worked in hospitals, but food didn't really come into. I think when you've got to organise something. I mean, who has a chef in their setting? I had 4 settings. I didn't have a chef in one of them, but I still felt we were giving the children a balanced diet. And one of the reasons why I didn't have a chef was because I felt that I wanted to pay practitioners more than having an extra person as a chef. And actually, we could all stuff food in an oven. You know, we didn't need somebody standing there for hours and hours and hours chopping vegetables up, for example, and frozen vegetables, I understood, were just as good as fresh ones, often better.
Nutritionally, they're often better. Yeah.
So what is perceived as perhaps what is perceived as possibly being better might not be.
No.
So I was certainly. So we had cooks, and they just used to come in. I think it was 2 hours a day, and then the staff used to push everything into the dishwasher after meals. Okay, all right. I've got a little list of things. What else I've got on my list? I mean, for me, I think the relationship that that children have with their food, you know, where parents can't believe they're eating peas or drinking milk, and you know, you might do we used to often do a video running for a parents' evening of a meal times or a particular activity. And parents used to be astonished. Oh, that's the other thing I was going to say. It's about talking about something that really used to bug. Well, we never used to do it, but it was very easy to do. Was talking to parents, you know, as the child's going home, about what they ate for dinner and what they didn't eat. You know, having those conversations in front of the child, you know, that they didn't eat their dinner very well today, or they didn't eat their peas or what have you. particularly for children who well, for any child, but the children that were struggling with eating in a group or had sensory processing problems, or just didn't know how to use cutlery. You know, they out of their no, I don't mean in a cultural way. I meant in a developmental way. You know, they weren't using cutlery at home, or they weren't sitting at a table to eat at home. So it was all really very strange. You know, to have those conversations in front of the child at the end of the day, I think is absolutely awful. We'd tell the parents, we won't tell you anything. We're only going to do anything where we'll tell you all the positive stuff.
I think, is that not changing? Because I remember when my son was at nursery, we had the app, and it was kind of fed through the app, and you would find out what about their day. And at handover, it was just kind of like, here they are, they've had a lovely day. They're, you know, they're filthy or whatever.
It's just that it's just, yes, we have an app, and parents can, key persons can do it that way too. But it's because the parents are so hooked on that, is that, you know, the child, is the child happy, is the child safe, and are they going to be hungry at the end of the day? You know, and so it was almost that's what the parents wanted to hear, not necessarily what I would prefer them to hear about what the child's learned today and what experiences they've had, and maybe they could do something similar like that at home with their child. You know, okay, we've got somebody. I work in a nursery. Why it is compulsory or good practice for children to serve themselves, even though it is not a statutory requirement. Well, in my view, children should choose what they want to eat. And so if you give them as I said, we did give them a little of everything so they could taste everything, but then they were allowed to take more of what they wanted to eat. And food times, in my view, should be a social occasion. It shouldn't just be about the eating. It should be about passing the dish to each other, or passing the water jug. There's so much learning there. And as an Ofsted inspector, when I used to do that role, you know, there's so much learning that can actually happen during a meal time for children, including the conversation and what they recall, what they've done in the morning, recall what they did at home, talk about home, etc. It's not just about the food for me. I'm not actually sure if this is a question or whether this is a statement. I think, but there's lots of things. Sorry, Louise. There's lots of things that are not statutory requirements, but we do it because it's good practice, and because perhaps we know more about the good practice and the research than the person that put together the statutory requirement.
Yeah, no, that's
that
true.
Makes sense?
I think it's good practice from a nutritional point of view, because actually when children are more relaxed, you've mentioned sensory issues, and this won't be the case for all children with certainly with sensory issues with food, but for children, if they feel more relaxed in their food environment, they will be more likely to eat food. And as Catherine said, with the sitting there and chatting and helping them, obviously the older groups are doing this. We're not expecting, you know, all ages to do this. But to be sitting there with their friends at the table, they feel like little grown-ups, and they're seeing somebody get some more shepherd's pie. I love myself a bit of that. And, you know, but they're relaxed, and people will eat more when they're relaxed. Children will try more things when they're relaxed. If we're giving them a full plate and hovering over them and watching their every mouthful to monitor what they've eaten, they're going to feel that pressure. And that, with some children, can increase anxiety over meal times, and they just want to kind of get away and leave, so they don't feel they're being observed all the time. So I think, you know, if you're able to not leave them to it, obviously you have to be very close on hand for safety reasons, but leave them to it to the point where they feel independent, then I think it helps them to eat more, but also to try more. They feel more in control, they feel more grown up, and they feel more relaxed, and I think that's important.
And even for toddlers, I mean, we had the serving dishes, but they weren't put on the table. But even for toddlers, you know, they can ask for more. You know, it's even if they sign it, you know, even tiny children can sign that they want more. And obviously they'll push their bowl away if they don't want it. So it's encouraging that conversation. And also it's about choice. It's about, you know, we should empower children to have choice. We do with activities, you know, well, I say we do. Good nurseries will have a variety of activities and the children will choose what they want to do, or the environment that they're in, the children will choose where they want to go and play. And I think the same should be around food as well, particularly snack time. You know, you can offer lots of different types of snack for children to choose, all being fairly or very healthy. And children, you know, I think that's good for them. I think that's good for them to choose what they have. So can I ask? I can't see who's asking the question, but so
Harriet?
in your nursery, Harriet, do you serve the food up for them and present them with a plate? How does it work? Please share. Don't mean to knock your nursery practice, by the way. No, you may go back and have a chat about this. I mean, always. I mean, my nurseries were running for 32 years, and I stopped working in them about 5 years ago. And we always allowed the children to help themselves to food. So it's been a bit normal for me. However, because I've done quality assurance work, I know that's not the case. What about, I mean, and the other thing that I feel quite strongly about in a nursery is where a child is given a red plate because they've got an allergy, and every other child's got an ordinary plate and this child's got a red one, because it tells the whole team that this child's got an allergy and what's on this plate is perhaps different to everybody else's. I think that's I don't like that. I
do see why that's necessary, though. I know in most settings I work with allergy menus, and I know why you say that it needs to be a different colour of the kitchen. Otherwise, you know, it could be quite a nasty encounter for the child to have.
I just think there are other ways it can be done in a less institutional.
I always try to make sure that the places I work with have their allergy meal look as close to the main menu meal as possible, so they're not having a different colour plate and a completely different looking meal, because then that makes them feel even more different. But I think I can understand why people have the different coloured plate. I can understand it. I can see your point, but I can
okay. The same lady, I think, said we serve the food and they empty their dirty plates themselves, and I agree with that. I think that's really important too. But one child would stack the plates, and then an adult would, because they were heavy plates, because they were china, they would move them away from the table. And just asking somebody to pass the plate across. Oh, good, we're getting some comments. I love this. Okay. It's a waiting time for the children. Absolute. Well, yes. But if they, okay, yeah, I get it. And I don't like children having to wait for anything. I don't like children lining up, which is why we always did it a table at a time. And because we gave them a little bit of food on their plate, so when they arrived at the table, that it would be there. So they'd arrive at the table to their place. They'd have a set place. So they always sat in the same place, or certainly on the same side of the table, because obviously children come different times of the week. And then, so they would be having their extras at different times because they already have something on their plate to eat. So they wouldn't have to wait for their food. The food wouldn't be getting cold, if that makes sense. But it's a very good point. And this is why I think, you know, in a nursery setting, in a group setting, it can be very long-winded and boring for the children if they're finished eating. You know, lunchtime should really be about 20 minutes. in my view. But I agree with that. So, and also, what about what we haven't touched on is about children growing their own food. You know, making soup from the vegetables that they've cooked, that they've grown.
Well, I'm obviously all in favour of this, and my other business, I've got a community interest company called the Good Food Academy. So that is all about trying to get grants to do things like that in nursery settings.
Oh, so I didn't know anything about that.
Oh, yeah,
so that's
yeah,
not on the. That's not on the.
That's not on the side. No, I don't. It's newly incorporated, so I'm not very good at remembering it. But yeah, so my whole thing with that is to get grants for these magical sort of like hydro veg systems, where they're very low maintenance, and they start at sort of 26 to 78 plants is the smallest one. So it's suitable for a nursery where you haven't got to be tending an allotment all the time, but children they grow quite quickly as well. So we all have quite short attention spans, and you want to kind of see something come to fruition quite quickly. Not, well, we've got to turn the soil and wait 8 months and you might see some shoots. So they're quite good. So so we kind of have this, the whole idea is that we have this, you don't even need a big space. This suits urban nurseries who don't have a big outdoor space as well, because you don't need to have a big patch to do it. So growing veg is obviously amazing for children to see where food comes from, to understand some elements of the time it takes. So everything's not instant, because we don't need to have instant gratification in every part of our lives, which is what's happening with teenagers. Very much at the moment, everything is instant, and grown-ups too. And actually I read a report on the psychology of instant gratification and what it's doing to our temperament, and it's making us all quite angry, and that is not a good state to be. So anything that takes away from that and actually brings us back down to a mindful activity that reminds us that we're not in charge all the time and things are outside of our control. And I think growing food is really important. It is seen as something that I think many settings, urban settings in deprived areas, think it's not for us. We can't do that. The whole thing with my community interest company is to try and say, well, you can, this is for you. It ticks so many things in so many aspects of development that actually we if we can all be trying to do that, then that's one thing I'd like to try and do. But I appreciate it needs to be funded sometimes, which is what I'm trying to do with that.
Okay, we had chickens actually, and they were fab for producing eggs for cooking. Right, we do have children that bring in a packed lunch, and they are separated from those who eat nursery food to avoid confusion. What is your opinion on that?
Me or you? I guess you have the same policy on allergies with them, so you haven't got that cross-contamination risk. Because I guess if you're segregating them, is it because they're not sharing with their friends who are potentially allergic to something that they're kindly sharing with them that could cause a reaction? I guess that might be why you're doing that as a safety thing. Which would make sense. But they do it in schools, as in primary schools as well. The packed lunch people get taken off to a different place. And the social bit worries me slightly. My child's always been very good with food and is quite happy to have whatever. And the school is okay. I've obviously assessed their school menu and it's fine. But I always feel slightly that, why should you be kind of like put in a separate area because you've got a packed lunch, because you could have very good reasons for needing to have a packed lunch. But if it's to be based on sort of safety and allergies, then I could understand why you'd be doing it. But if there was no cross-contamination risk and they could sit with their friends, and I personally think they would have no problem sitting there, unless they were going to tuck in and start eating the food, which could happen if they like the look of the food in front of them and start tucking in and helping themselves to that.
Yes. I think it's more of probably a management scenario. They come and sit over here because here's your packed lunches, and the other children can get on with theirs. I don't know if I've got a strong view either way. I think it's the singling out of the particular child that bothers me. And if we're looking at food behaviours of staff that could influence the children, I just would like everybody to feel included and have an inclusive sort of meal times. But so I think if there's a group of children all having a packed lunch together, that I think would be fine by me. If it's just one child or two children sitting on their own because they've got packed lunches and the others haven't, then I have a thing about packed lunches, really. I mean, we didn't do it. I know parents could, and should be able to bring in a packed lunch, but it went against our ethos, really, and we encouraged parents not to do it, and they didn't. So we didn't have that issue.
I mean, if I could put a two-penny thing on packed lunches in general, I think if you're trying to embed a food culture where you can be fully embracing why you're doing things with the menu, and when I work with menus, I do like a menu key. So this dish is supporting your brain, and we talk to the children about it. This dish is supporting your brain. This dish is building you strong bones. This dish is going to help you feel happy, help you sleep well. We talk about all those things on the menu. If you've got children with a packed lunch, they're excluded from that whole food culture of the setting. So for me, food is about more than just sitting down for that one meal. It's about the food culture. So if you're embracing this food culture in your setting, which is much more than just what's on the plate, but the whole ethos behind the plate, the whole ethos of the thought that's gone into everything, and the children are engaged in that, the children understand food and they understand biology, because children are fascinated. The body is fascinating. There's so many fascinating facts in the body, and children should and can be engaged in biological facts from the age of 2. We can tell them about facts. They're fine. They are much more capable than we often think they are. But we can't include the packed lunch children because we haven't made.
And also, there's no control on what's in the packed lunch boxes there, and you can have rules and regulations. Your setting can state, your packed lunch mustn't include this, that, t'other. But when it actually comes to the parent filling the packed lunch box, and then the child opens it, and it's full of chocolate. I mean, what do you do as a practitioner? I mean, so I just have a thing about packed lunches, I'm afraid. I think, given my reasons. But I think providing children are not singled out in any way over food any more than you'd single them out over anything else that you do in the setting. You wouldn't, you don't, if a parent comes in and says, I don't want my child going outside because, it has to be a really, really, really good reason why you're going to agree to that, isn't it? Because all the children go outside and they learn so much from being outside. Why would one child not be receiving what you're offering the other children? So, yeah. Okay. Anybody got anything else? How are we doing for time? Trouble with these things, you see. Oh, we're doing quite well. We really enjoy ourselves, and we sometimes forget about the time. And obviously, everybody's been at work all day. So, is there anything else that anybody wants to bring up? The Spark debate in what month are we in? In June, July, will be with Lynette Brock, who runs Schema Play. So we'll be talking about schemas and all things to do around that sort of side of learning, because this is learning. Food is. We are teaching children a lot, and I think we're all going to go away and think more deeply about what are we actually teaching them. Because we're teaching them anyway, but we need to perhaps be a bit more careful about what we are actually teaching them, not just about what we're actually giving them to eat. That's what I have to say. Okay, right. You sure there's nothing else? Louise, is there anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up?
I could keep you all here for days. There's so much to this subject, but no, not for today. Not for today. There's many more things we could cover, but
yeah. Well, Louise's details are going to come up, so I'm going to run the end, and I hope to see you next month. And thank you very, very much, Louise. It's been really interesting. My mind is always blown away by these debates. I always go away with lots of new knowledge. It's fab.